The Oak Haven community pool was not just chlorine and concrete. It was the sticky, sun-drenched heart of Karen Miller's summer. For her two children, 9-year-old Leo and 7-year-old Maya, it was a boundless, chlorinated ocean of freedom, a place where their sun-bleached hair and wrinkled fingertips measured the passage of time. This summer, however, had ended with a sickening pre-dawn abruptness. It was a Tuesday. Karen was nursing her first cup of coffee, the morning quiet only broken by the chittering of cardinals outside, when her tranquility was shattered by a sound she hadn't heard since Leo was 3. True, inconsolable grief. Leo stood in the middle of the kitchen, shirtless, wearing the faded swim trunks he insisted on sleeping in during July. His face was blotchy, his chest heaving, and Maya was a sobbing anchor clutched to his leg. "Mom, it's gone!" Leo gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the window that framed the community green. "They put up the fence! They took it!" Karen's heart sank, not because of the pool, but because of the raw despair on her children's faces. It was the look of betrayal, the sudden realization that the world's rules were arbitrary and cruel. She hurried outside, her slippers padding against the damp dew of the walkway. The sight was jarring. Overnight, a 10-foot-high industrial chain-link fence, topped with rolls of razor wire that glinted maliciously in the early sun, had bifurcated the community property. The Olympic-sized pool, the beloved aquamarine jewel of Oak Haven, now lay utterly isolated, padlocked behind a gate emblazoned with a severe, newly minted sign. "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Triton Property Management." The pool was still full of sparkling, expensive water, a crueler irony than if it had been drained. It was visible yet unattainable. "They didn't warn anyone," Karen muttered, pulling Leo and Maya close. This action was not merely an inconvenience. It was an act of architectural violence. The pool had been the communal cooling tank for 3 decades. Its sudden seizure felt like a hostile annexation. Karen, a single mom who worked as an operations manager and lived by the mantra of efficiency, didn't scream or panic. She went inside, poured the rest of her coffee, and transitioned into problem-solving mode. "Okay, guys, first we breathe. Then we figure out who Triton is and why they think they can do this," she said, her voice a calm, focused drill. She quickly learned Triton Property Management was not an oversight. It was a corporate entity that had bought a small, forgotten parcel of land bordering Oak Haven's southern edge. Their argument, laid out in an email thread Karen found later that morning, was chillingly simple. The pool and the immediate surrounding deck, though used exclusively by Oak Haven for years, sat technically on the newly acquired boundary line. Triton was asserting their ownership, intending to convert the area into an exclusive amenity for a luxury condo development they planned to break ground on next year. Her initial efforts were textbook civility. She called the number on the fence. It was a corporate voicemail box, overflowing. She drafted an email to Triton's head of legal affairs, articulating the social and financial loss to the Oak Haven HOA, citing precedents of adverse possession and common use rights. She received a 2-sentence reply from a paralegal. The Triton acquisition was legal and complete. Any further communication must be directed through our retained counsel. This dismissiveness, this corporate shrug, ignited something primal in Karen. It wasn't about the property line anymore. It was about the deliberate erasure of joy, the cold-blooded disregard for a community. The next few days were excruciating. The neighborhood was in chaos. Parents were furious but disorganized. Some suggested fundraising for a lawsuit. Others simply resigned themselves to driving 40 minutes to the public water park. But for Leo and Maya, the pool's absence was a physical ache. They would stand at the newly erected fence, their small hands gripping the cold wire, staring at the motionless water, a monument to their lost summer. "Can't we just ask the sheriff to open the gate, Mom?" Maya asked one evening, tears welling up as she pushed uneaten mac and cheese around her plate. "The sheriff can't touch private property, sweetie," Karen explained gently, her gaze fixed on the Triton logo in the email on her laptop screen. But Maya's simple question, combined with the weight of her children's disappointment, shifted Karen's focus. If Triton operated strictly by the letter of the law, then so would she. If they weaponized paperwork, she would use history against them. Karen pulled up the Oak Haven Community Covenants, a digitized PDF that weighed 57 pages, dating back to 1985. It was a document written in dry, legalistic language, full of obscure easements and archaic terminology. For the next 72 hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the sound of silence where splashing should have been, Karen Miller became an expert in Oak Haven property law. She cross-referenced the 1985 covenants with the 1998 re-subdivision map. She hunted through online county records, paying exorbitant fees for access to historical deeds. She was looking for a chink, a microscopic crack in Triton's fortress. Most residents were focused on the pool itself, but Karen realized the true vulnerability wasn't the concrete. It was the access. At 3 a.m. on Friday, she found it, buried on page 41, Section D, subsection 3 of the 1998 Deed of Trust, was a clause. A perpetual ingress-egress easement, 18 feet in width, shall be maintained across the southern boundary lot, presently Lot 12A, to service utility lines, including but not limited to the primary drainage and filtration pump lines for the Oak Haven Recreational Facility, pool. Lot 12A was the parcel Triton had bought. Triton had fenced off the pool, but by doing so, they had also fenced off and rendered inaccessible the primary pool pump and filtration system, which sat exactly 18 feet from the original property pin, the very easement described in the document. Triton hadn't just taken the pool. They had illegally obstructed a registered utility easement. That wasn't a civil dispute. That was a regulatory violation. Karen's heart pounded a furious rhythm against her ribs. She printed the 1998 deed, highlighting the section in blazing yellow. The following morning, she bypassed her HOA board and drove straight to the Municipal Law Enforcement Center. She didn't ask for a judge or a civil suit. She asked for a regulatory enforcement officer. She presented the deed, the map, and Triton's curt, dismissive email. The officer, a weathered man named Sergeant Harrison, frowned, reading the highlighted section. "This is about a pool, ma'am." "This is about a utility easement, Sergeant," Karen corrected him, her voice perfectly level. "That easement services critical infrastructure, and it has been illegally obstructed by a corporate entity. The pool's closure is a symptom of the crime, not the crime itself." Harrison studied the razor wire and the accompanying photo Karen provided. He looked up at Karen, noticing the fierce, almost frightening clarity in her eyes. She wasn't an angry mom anymore. She was a legal precision instrument, honed by the suffering of her kids. "If what you're saying is accurate, Ms. Miller," Harrison finally conceded, pushing the papers across the desk, "Triton has violated county infrastructure codes. That's a mandatory enforcement action." He paused, picking up the phone. "We'll need to issue a notice to vacate obstruction. If they don't comply immediately, we cut the lock." Karen walked out of the station, the mid-morning sun feeling strangely cold on her face. She was no longer just the mother fighting for her children's summer. She was the one who had unearthed the weapon. She drove back to Oak Haven, pulling into her driveway just as a dark blue and white patrol car, lights silently flashing, pulled up to the Triton property fence line. Karen cut her engine, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sergeant Harrison was already outside, approaching the imposing chain-link gate with a clipboard in his hand and a heavy-duty bolt cutter hanging from his belt. This was it. The moment of consequence. A black SUV with tinted windows bearing the Triton logo screeched to a halt on the opposite side of the fence. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in an immaculately tailored, pale gray suit. Mr. Vance, the corporate paralegal who had sent the two-sentence email of dismissal. Vance saw the police car. He saw Sergeant Harrison, and then his gaze locked onto Karen, who was walking slowly, deliberately toward the scene, her shadow long and unwavering. Vance's face, previously smooth with corporate indifference, fractured into a mask of sudden cold alarm. He had clearly underestimated the suburban mother. The sheriff was here. The pool was on the line, and the man who thought he held all the power had just realized he was standing on an active, legal landmine. End of part 1. The major turning point is the arrival of the enforcement, transitioning the conflict from civil grievance to mandatory legal action. The air by the chain-link fence was charged, vibrating with unspoken threats and the metallic scent of tension. Mr. Vance, the paralegal from Triton Property Management, smoothed the lapels of his impeccable gray suit, the gesture a desperate attempt to restore his corporate composure. His initial look of shock, seeing a marked patrol vehicle and a uniformed sergeant, had curdled into a tight professional aggression aimed squarely at Karen. "Sergeant," Vance began, his voice polished but edged with acid, "I fail to understand why municipal law enforcement is involved in a civil property dispute. This land, Lot 12A, is the sole exclusive property of Triton Holdings. I suggest you step back from the fence." Sergeant Harrison, a man whose patience had been forged in 30 years of neighborhood disputes and bureaucratic deadlock, did not move. He was a sturdy pillar of khaki and enforced procedure. He held the clipboard out, ignoring Vance entirely and addressing the fence itself. "I am Sergeant Harrison, Municipal Enforcement Division. I am here to serve and enforce a notice to vacate obstruction, filed under County Code 401.7, regarding an illegally blocked utility easement," Harrison stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the silence of the street. He then turned his focus to Vance. "Mr. Vance, if you are the representative for Triton Holdings, you are served." Vance took the clipboard, his eyes scanning the legal language, his tailored suit suddenly seeming too warm, too heavy. His eyes stopped on the highlighted clause Karen had meticulously unearthed. A perpetual ingress-egress easement, 18 feet in width, shall be maintained across the southern boundary lot, presently Lot 12A, to service utility lines, including but not limited to the primary drainage and filtration pump lines for the Oak Haven Recreational Facility, pool. Vance's practiced indifference cracked further. He looked from the document to the fence, then back to Karen, standing 10 feet away with her arms crossed, the sun turning her expression into a defiant silhouette. "This is an oversight, Sergeant." "A trivial technical error," Vance stammered, pulling out his phone. "The pool lines are defunct. We can reroute them. This is simply harassment, initiated by Ms. Miller because her children are inconvenienced. We will file an emergency injunction. You can file for a pardon from the Pope." "Mr. Vance, the code doesn't care about your intent or the children," Harrison countered, his hand resting on the heavy black handle of the bolt cutters. "The code states a registered utility easement is blocked. That is a mandatory, non-negotiable violation. You have 60 seconds to provide the key and vacate the obstruction, or I will use reasonable force to comply with the order." 60 seconds? Vance scoffed, trying to laugh, the sound thin and artificial. "You realize Triton Holdings retains the most expensive legal counsel in this state? Any damage to this fence, any delay in our planned land use, will result in immediate litigation against the county and against you personally." Karen finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension, clear and deadly calm. "Mr. Vance, the 1998 deed of trust confirms the easement. The fence is on the easement. You cannot reroute the lines, because the lines are the infrastructure the easement was created to service. The violation isn't trivial. It's a failure of your due diligence when you acquired the land. And Sergeant Harrison is simply doing his job to protect county infrastructure." Vance whirled on her, his face flushed. You think this is a victory? You think cutting a lock changes anything about the property line? This parcel belongs to Triton." "It changes the fact that you no longer dictate the terms of access, Mr. Vance," Karen replied, taking a step closer. The children, Leo and Maya, had emerged from their house and were watching from the front porch, small, anxious figures waiting for the verdict. "It changes the fact that you're in violation and we're following the law, not just your corporate edict." Harrison held up his hand. "Time's up, Mr. Vance." The sound of the bolt cutters was loud, a clean, violent crunch that echoed across the quiet suburban street. Harrison dropped the massive, severed brass lock to the pavement. The gate swung inward, dragging its base across the gravel with a grating. metallic shriek. In that instant, the razor-wired barrier that had felt insurmountable collapsed. Reduced to a common gate on its hinges, the victory was immediate and deeply satisfying. The fence itself was still there, but the immediate obstruction was gone. The 18-foot utility easement was clear. Karen felt a wave of dizzying relief. She looked at the pump house, sitting 18 feet inside the newly opened boundary, now legally accessible. She then looked toward her porch. Leo let out a soundless, joyful shout, raising his small fist in the air. Maya was already running toward the pool, only to be stopped by the HOA president, Mr. Peterson, who had rushed over, mouth agape, holding his morning newspaper. "Karen, what in God's name happened?" Peterson exclaimed, his face shifting rapidly between outrage and stunned disbelief. "Justice, Mr. Peterson," Karen said, a genuine if brief smile touching her lips. "We won the first round. The pool lines are now accessible for maintenance. The fight for the pool is still ahead, but Triton can no longer starve it of life support." Vance watched the interaction, his fury held rigid by a thin veneer of control. He knew this was a massive tactical error on Triton's part, a failure that had been exposed by an amateur. His job was to contain the damage. He stepped close to Karen, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. Harrison was already turning back to his vehicle, his duty fulfilled. "You're very good with old documents, Ms. Miller," Vance murmured, his eyes glittering. "You should stick to reading paper, not crossing corporations. We bought that land for $30 million. We will not be deterred by a clerical error on page 41. You wanted a legal battle? You have it. We will not be cutting a single check or signing a single negotiation until the Oak Haven Homeowners Association and everyone associated with this stunt regrets the day they crossed Triton Holdings." He stepped back, climbed into the black SUV and slammed the door. The vehicle peeled away, leaving a plume of dust and a sense of cold dread in its wake. Karen watched it go, the elation from the easement victory rapidly fading. Vance's threat wasn't a bluff. It was a promise. She had embarrassed a multi-million-dollar corporation publicly and legally. The skirmish was over, but the war had just received a terrifying escalation. That evening, a single, anonymous letter arrived in the mail at Karen's house, not addressed to her, but clearly intended for her. It was a photocopy of the front of her mortgage statement, with a single handwritten line scrawled across the bottom in neat, red ink. "The easiest way to make a pool disappear is to drain the house that uses it. End of part 2. The beat is a shock major turning point. The conflict escalates from property law, easement, to personal financial intimidation, the mortgage threat, changing the nature of the stakes completely." The anonymous note lay on Karen's kitchen island, bathed in the harsh white glare of the overhead light. It was a single, flimsy photocopy of her mortgage statement, the numbers a stark reminder of the 20 years of effort required to keep this small patch of suburban security. The red ink line. "The easiest way to make a pool disappear is to drain the house that uses it," was not a threat of physical violence, but a calculated promise of financial ruin. It landed with the weight of a physical blow. Karen didn't react with tears or panic, but with a cold, terrifying stillness. She felt the corporate machine, Vance, Triton Holdings, and their unlimited legal budget pressing down on the fragile walls of her home. Her first rational move was to call her mortgage servicer. The representative, bored and automated, confirmed everything was current, no flags, no inquiries. This only made the threat colder. It wasn't an active move yet. It was a clear warning that her most vulnerable point had been identified, logged, and marked for future execution. The immediate relief from the successful easement action had evaporated, replaced by a consuming need to protect her children's future, not just their summer fun. The community reaction, meanwhile, was a chaotic pendulum swing. Karen, once ignored, was suddenly the subject of intense focus. Some neighbors, the families with young kids, hailed her as a hero, a modern-day David who had stood up to Goliath. Others, primarily the retired couples focused on property values and avoiding litigation, were furious. The fallout culminated 2 days later in a hastily convened tense HOA meeting held in the clubhouse meeting room, which suddenly felt too small for the collective anxiety. Mr. Peterson, the HOA president, stood at the podium, his face sweaty and purple with stress, slamming his gavel. "Order, order, people! We must address Ms. Miller's actions!" Peterson fixed Karen with a hostile glare. "Karen, you acted unilaterally. You circumvented the board. You used the association's documentation to initiate a mandatory county enforcement action without legal counsel, exposing every single homeowner in Oak Haven to potential multi-million-dollar litigation from Triton Holdings. I secured access to our utility lines." "Mr. Peterson," Karen interjected, her voice sharp, "which Triton had illegally obstructed. That action was mandated by county code, not civil law. It cost the HOA $0, and it prevented Triton from suffocating the pool by cutting off its pump access." A retired resident, Mrs. Delgado, stood up, shaking her head. "We appreciate what you did for the children, Karen, but now they're coming after all of us. I got a call from my realtor this morning. Triton is aggressively buying up secondary liens and claims against the development company that built our homes. They are making noise, Karen, and noise costs money." The meeting devolved into an ugly shouting match. The pro-Karen faction lauded her bravery. The anti-Karen faction accused her of being a reckless instigator. Peterson looked defeated. "This is what Vance wanted," Karen announced, standing up and projecting her voice over the noise. "Division. He wanted us arguing over who to blame instead of how to fight. He wants us to believe we can't afford to defend ourselves. But we have the law on our side. And they have 20 lawyers and infinite time," Peterson shouted, throwing his hands up. "We don't have a litigation budget, Karen. Triton is already moving. I received official notification this afternoon. They're not filing a civil suit yet. They're doing something far worse." Peterson pointed to a projection screen showing a dry official letterhead from the State Environmental Resources Board, SERB. The letter informed the Oak Haven HOA that Triton Holdings had filed a formal petition challenging the certificate of zoning compliance for the Oak Haven recreational facility, the pool, and requesting a full COI environmental and structural audit of the pool's 1990 construction permits. "They're not arguing over the land anymore," Peterson whispered, his voice cracking. "They're arguing the pool itself is illegal. They claim it was built on a protected seasonal wetland without proper mitigation, or that the filtration system leaks and poses an environmental hazard." The room fell into stunned silence. The threat was terrifyingly comprehensive. If Triton could prove a single environmental or zoning flaw from 30 years ago, the pool wouldn't just be seized. It would be condemned and demolished. Karen felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. This wasn't about an easement anymore. This was a sophisticated regulatory siege designed to exploit bureaucratic weaknesses and bleed the HOA dry through endless compliance costs. Triton wasn't playing checkers. They were launching a surgical strike. She realized the painful truth. She couldn't beat this on her own, not with a highlighter and a county code book. She needed a specialist, someone who could match Triton's ruthlessness and navigate the labyrinth of zoning law and environmental compliance. The next morning, Karen drove 40 miles outside of Oak Haven to a dilapidated industrial park. She navigated a warren of dusty warehouses until she found a small, unmarked office door with a single name crudely stenciled on the glass: R.E. Kennedy, Property Law and Litigation. R.E. Kennedy was a legend in local circles, a brutal, highly effective real estate attorney known for destroying opponents in zoning disputes. He was also prohibitively expensive, working mostly for cash and rumored to have a severe drinking problem, but he knew the state regulatory system better than the people who wrote the rules. Karen pushed open the door. The office was Spartan and reeked faintly of stale tobacco and old coffee. Behind a cluttered metal desk sat a man, Kennedy, who looked 50 years old and was currently cleaning his glasses with a corner of his tie. Karen laid the SERB audit request, the 1998 deed of trust, and the photocopy of her threatening mortgage statement on his desk. Kennedy didn't look up immediately. He just nodded toward the papers. "Another HOA dispute. Cut the fence, now they're cutting the pool. I get 3 of these a week. Triton Holdings is trying to condemn the pool on environmental grounds," Karen stated, her voice tight. They are also making threats about my personal mortgage. I need someone who can fight fire with fire. Not civil procedure, regulatory warfare. Kennedy finally looked up, his eyes sharp and surprisingly lucid behind the clean lenses. He picked up the mortgage threat, reading the red ink line twice. He set it down, a flicker of something almost human crossing his face. Triton. They play dirty, Kennedy mused, leaning back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. He pointed to the documents. The easement only won you access. This SERB challenge. This is designed to bankrupt the HOA on paperwork, forcing a quick sale. They don't want the land. They want the pool gone. He steepled his fingers, staring at Karen. You're acting alone. You're exposed. The HOA will fold the second the first bill for the environmental impact statement arrives. Why should I take this on? This is a lost cause, Ms. Miller. Karen met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Because, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce near whisper, the Oak Haven pool was built with a specific, legally binding 30-year-old variance that permits it on that specific wetland. Triton's lawyers missed it, and I know exactly where the original sealed paperwork is filed. If you can get us the injunction to stop the demolition, I can give you the blueprint to win. Kennedy tilted his head, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He picked up his phone, his eyes still on Karen. The original variance, huh? That's good paper. That changes things. He then spoke into the phone. Get me the SERB contact list for the Oak Haven filing, extension 110. Tell them Mr. Kennedy is calling, and get me the Triton Holdings General Counsel line. Tell them the war is no longer a community skirmish. It's a matter of professional pride. The battleground had shifted from a chain-link fence to the dry, bureaucratic air of the State Environmental Resources Board, SERB, hearing room. R.E. Kennedy, fueled by a relentless stream of black coffee and a terrifying clarity, moved with the tactical precision of a predator. He didn't engage in polite debate. He used procedural law like a surgical weapon. Facing him was Mr. Vance, flanked by two corporate lawyers whose hourly rates likely exceeded Karen's monthly salary. Vance had expected to simply present Triton's petition, a 30-page report alleging the pool was an environmental disaster waiting to happen and receive a speedy order for compliance and eventual demolition. Kennedy crushed that expectation in the first 20 minutes, I object, Your Honor. To the entire premise of Triton Holdings' petition, Kennedy drawled, his voice rasping through the otherwise sterile room. He wasn't arguing the facts. He was arguing the process. They claimed the 1990 Oak Haven construction was non-compliant. However, we have filed a simultaneous motion proving the existence of an original, sealed wetland mitigation variance, a legal instrument that fundamentally exempts the Oak Haven recreational facility from the current audit criteria. Vance's head snapped toward Kennedy. Objection! Counsel is attempting to introduce hearsay evidence. Where is this so-called sealed variance? It is not in the public record. It's not in the public record, because the original developers filed it specifically, under seal with the county recorder to prevent future land developers from exploiting the precedent. Mr. Vance, Kennedy countered, leaning closer to the judge, it's not hearsay, it's a matter of complex archival retrieval. Until the petitioner can prove that this variance does not exist, they lack standing to request a full environmental audit based solely on current code. We request a minimum 6-week stay on all SERB proceedings to allow my client to retrieve the official sealed document. The judge, clearly worn down by the rapid-fire legal grenades, hammered his gavel. The request was granted. Triton's regulatory siege was stalled. Vance left the hearing room white-knuckled with fury. He had been outmaneuvered by a man he considered a washed-up relic. He knew that if that variance was real, Triton's entire, multi-million-dollar strategy, the condemnation, the cheap acquisition, the luxury condos, would be dead. Meanwhile, Karen was engaged in the physical, desperate hunt for the good paper she had promised Kennedy. She knew the variance existed, but she needed the sealed physical copy, the original with the county stamp. Her search started logically at the county archives, a massive humidity-controlled tomb of paperwork. But the developer, Oak Haven Estates, had dissolved in 2005, and their records were disorganized. Karen spent 2 days wading through endless microfiche and faded blueprints, returning home smelling of dust and disappointment. The pressure from the HOA was intensifying daily. The anti-Karen faction, led by the panicky Mr. Peterson, had circulated a petition demanding the HOA board formally censure Karen, fire Kennedy, who they were afraid to pay, and negotiate a surrender to Triton. Peterson cornered her outside her home late one afternoon. "The CERB just slapped us with a $15,000 preliminary filing fee, Karen. We can't afford this fight. Kennedy is a shark! He's going to gut us!" "The fee is part of the stall tactic, David. It's necessary," Karen said, trying to keep her voice low so Leo and Maya, playing quietly indoors, wouldn't hear. "Triton is betting you will fold. I have one lead left. Give me 48 hours. Her last lead was a dead-end street. Eleanor Vance, no relation to Mr. Vance, the administrative assistant to Oakhaven Estates' CEO who had signed off on the original 1990 plat maps. Karen finally tracked the elderly woman down to a cramped, independent bookkeeping office 40 miles away. Eleanor was frail, sweet, and initially guarded. Karen presented the deed of trust and the dates. "The variance, Mrs. Vance, it should be in a red-stamped binder. It was sealed from the public record for 30 years. Eleanor sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "Mr. Kennedy is a nasty man, but a smart one. Yes, the red binder. Mr. Oakhaven called it his rainy day insurance. He was worried the county would change the wetland rules later." "Where is it?" Karen urged. Leaning forward, her heart hammering, Eleanor slowly pointed toward a single, heavy filing cabinet tucked into a dark corner. "When Oakhaven Estates dissolved, everything went to the county except for the insurance. I kept the red binder. Didn't trust the county to keep it sealed. I have it locked in that cabinet right there." Karen stared at the cabinet. 30 years of bureaucracy, corporate greed, and fear of ruin all boiled down to one small, dusty, forgotten metal box. Eleanor fumbled with a key ring, pulling off a large, ornate silver key. "It's yours." But Karen, when Mr. Oakhaven filed that, he made one condition, one strange line of instruction. What was it? It states that if the variance is ever unsealed and used in litigation, the pool maintenance funding, currently managed by the HOA, must be permanently restructured to be governed by a separate, specific trust fund established by the original Oakhaven Estates developer. The trust fund, now dormant, can only be administered by a single appointed steward of the oasis in perpetuity. Karen took the key, her fingers trembling. The victory suddenly came with a profound and ironic cost. She could save the pool, but the HOA would permanently lose control over it. She realized the consequence wasn't just on Triton, but on the entire community she was fighting for. She opened the cabinet. Inside, under a stack of outdated tax forms, was the red binder. The paper inside was crisp and yellowed, the county seal clear and unmistakable. The variance. Karen hugged the binder to her chest, whispering a thank you to Eleanor, and practically flew out the door. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows. She slid into her car, heart racing, and started the ignition. As she pulled out onto the quiet street, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Parked discreetly 2 blocks away, its lights off, was a black, unmarked sedan. It hadn't been there when she arrived. The driver, a muscular man in a dark jacket, was talking into a headset, his eyes fixed directly on her car. Karen had the evidence, but Mr. Vance and Triton Holdings knew she had just found it. The game was no longer confined to courtrooms and paper trails. It was a high-speed pursuit, and Karen Miller was holding the key to a multi-million-dollar land deal.